We are setting aside some time today to conduct a thorough analysis of the sources shared with us, focusing on Gary Ridgway, who is much better known as the Green River Killer.
Hmm.
Our goal here is to really extract the facts, to look at the scale of his crimes, his personal contradictions, and of course, the decades-long investigation that finally led to his conviction.
That's so important.
And through all of this, our mission is clear. We want to understand the history, the complexities, and, the profound human tragedy here, always keeping a respectful focus on the victims and their families.
Absolutely. That respectful clarity is paramount, particularly in a case like this where the victims were already so incredibly marginalized.
Right.
When you look across the sheer volume of sources, police reports, psychological evaluations, all of it, it's very easy to get lost in just the statistics.
The numbers are staggering.
Yeah. They are. But what really emerges from the documents is this narrative of a profound systemic failure, which was then followed by this monumental, decades-long effort by investigators to reclaim the identities and the dignity of the women he targeted.
So we have to look at the facts as they're presented. I think we should start with the basics, the chilling scope of his crimes and that alias.
The alias, yes.
Okay, so let's unpack this subject. We're discussing Gary Leon Ridgway. He was born in 1949, an individual whose name is now, well, it's permanently etched into the history of American crime.
Yeah, and forever linked to that moniker, the Green River Killer.
Sometimes also the Green River Strangler. And these names, it's important to note, they're not some sensational thing the press just made up. They are geographical markers tied directly to where this all began.
Exactly. The source of that nickname is very straightforward, but it carries this immense weight, especially for the Seattle area. The first 5 victims, they were discovered either entirely or in part near the Green River in Washington State.
It's just south of Seattle.
Right, south of Seattle. And that stretch of terrain, it quickly became synonymous with fear in the early 1980s. It marked the epicenter of a killing spree whose true magnitude, it wouldn't be revealed for decades.
And when Ridgway was finally arrested, in 2001, he was ultimately convicted of murdering 49 women. And the offenses spanned a period from 1982 all the way through 1998.
49.
49 confirmed convictions. This number, just the confirmed number, at the moment of his arrest and sentencing, placed Ridgway in a historically grim category. The sources all confirm that, at the time, he was believed to be the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history.
Based on confirmed murders, yeah.
Based purely on confirmed murder.
And that historical context is so critical for understanding the immense pressure on the King County Task Force.
Of course.
Although, we do have to note the context shift that came later. The later revelations regarding Samuel Little, who claimed over 90 victims, with 60 of them verified.
Right.
But Ridgway's confirmed body count remains. It's just immense. And it had this devastating, immediate impact on the entire region. The comparison, it really highlights the complexity of quantifying these kinds of crimes. But the reality is that 49 verified convictions established him as one of the most prolific documented killers ever.
And what's, fascinating is the right word, maybe terrifying, is the gap between that confirmed number and what he himself said.
The confessions.
Yeah, the sources detail Ridgway confessing to a staggering number of victims. The range is anywhere from 71 to over 90.
Which is it's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is. So the 49 confirmed convictions, which were solidified by that landmark plea bargain we'll get into later, they represent the cases where law enforcement could definitively link him either through forensics or, critically, by using his own confessions to find the remains.
And that disparity, that gap between the confirmed count and the confessed number, it just underscores the depth of this tragedy. It signals that this investigation, in a way, is intrinsically ongoing.
It implies there are still victims out there.
Exactly. Victims whose identities are still unknown,
right,
or whose remains have just not been recovered.
Before we dig into the killer's timeline and pathology, I think it's vital that we focus on the victims themselves. It provides the necessary context for understanding why this killing spree was so devastating and, why it was so difficult for the task force to solve in those early years.
Yes, the sources are. Well, they're excruciatingly clear on the extreme vulnerability of the women he targeted. The vast majority of them were women and teenage girls.
And the ages are they're heartbreaking. The documents cite victims as young as 14, like Wendy Marie Stevens.
Just a child.
Yeah.
And the common profile was devastatingly consistent. Women who were alleged to be sex workers or runaways. Ridgway methodically sought out this population for a specific reason.
He chose them because they were vulnerable.
Precisely. They were in these circumstances, often lacking the immediate family or the kind of systemic infrastructure that would swiftly trigger a high-profile missing persons investigation.
And that detail it's foundational to the tragedy of this case. The fact that he specifically selected marginalized individuals, it speaks volumes about his pathology.
It does.
He was calculating the least amount of risk possible for himself. But it also speaks to the immense challenge the investigators faced, trying to track women whose disappearances often went unreported.
Or if they were reported, they received very little initial public attention, and that's due to the prevailing societal prejudices of the time.
Absolutely. The victims were, in so many cases, already struggling with such difficult lives, often having fled home or being caught in these cycles of poverty and addiction.
And the sheer brutality of the Green River Killer just compounded these existing hardships. The sources really force us to acknowledge the extreme vulnerability they faced and the profound failure of the system to protect them. The emotional weight of this case, it really rests so heavily on understanding that.
So to begin to understand the mechanism behind this sustained campaign of murder, we have to examine the contradictory and troubled pathology of Gary Ridgway, and that means tracing it back to his early life. He was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1949, the second of 3 sons. And according to the sources, his earliest developmental years were significantly impacted by his relationship with his mother.
The documents describe his mother as a domineering figure. She was reportedly very quick to inflict corporal punishment for really minor infractions, created this extremely rigid and fearful environment at home.
And that dynamic, as we learn later in the psychological evaluations, it planted the seeds for this profound internal conflict within Ridgway.
And this is where the pathology becomes just chillingly clear.
Yeah.
Ridgway later disclosed to defense psychologists that he experienced these intensely conflicting feelings, this volatile mix of anger and powerful sexual attraction toward his mother. He even admitted to fantasizing about killing her.
Wow. This description of a highly charged, love-hate, fixation-based relationship with the primary female figure in his life, that is a recurring and severe red flag we often see preceding sexualized violence.
It creates this volatile foundation where sex and aggression become permanently fused in the mind.
And on top of that, there's the father.
Right. Compounding this, the sources mention his father was a bus driver, and he frequently voiced his complaints about the presence of sex workers along his bus route.
So from a young age, Ridgway was exposed not only to this very conflicted female dynamic at home, but also to this normalized negative rhetoric about the very population he would later use and systematically murder.
Exactly.
We also see evidence of cognitive and educational struggles in his youth. The sources note he was dyslexic. He was held back a year in high school.
And his recorded IQ was measured in the low 80s.
Now, these facts don't cause violence, of course, but they do paint a picture of an individual who is academically and socially struggling to meet norms. And that could potentially amplify feelings of inadequacy or resentment.
And that internal strain seems to have found a terrifying external outlet, and very early on. The sources detail his first known violent act at the age of 16. 16. Ridgway lured a 6-year-old boy into a nearby woodland area and stabbed him. The blade went through his ribs and into his liver.
The boy survived, thankfully.
He did, thankfully. But this incident is just a clear and severe marker of the early onset of predatory and violent behavior. This was years before the Green River murders ever began.
So moving into his adulthood, we see this continuous attempt at conventionality that was constantly being undermined by this profound sexual instability.
After high school, he joins the Navy. He serves in Vietnam on a supply ship where he reportedly saw combat.
But his attempts at a normal life, they seem to dissolve almost immediately when he gets back. His first marriage to his high school sweetheart, it barely lasted a year.
And it ended because of his persistent infidelities and the fact that he contracted gonorrhea from sex workers. So this deeply ingrained pattern of soliciting marginalized women, even while trying to maintain a marital life, it started very early and was just relentlessly persistent.
And the subsequent marriages only reinforced this pattern of instability and aggression. The sources cite his ex-wife from his second marriage, Marcia Winslow. She described this terrifying incident where he actually placed her in a chokehold.
And the complexity, it just escalated even further with his second marriage and the profound emergence of what the sources call a religious conflict.
Right. This conflict it's maybe the most outwardly contradictory element of his entire persona.
I'd agree with that. During his second marriage, Ridgway became fervently religious. I mean, he was proselytizing door to door, reading the Bible aloud. He was even noted by acquaintances to cry during sermons. He was projecting this image of piety and deep devotion.
Yet at the exact same time, he was escalating his solicitation of sex workers and demonstrating this extreme, controlling aspect of his sexual fixation with his wife.
His ex-wives reported an insatiable sexual appetite, demanding sex multiple times a day.
And disturbingly, they noted that he often demanded they engage in sexual activity in public areas or in the woods. These are precisely the sort of secluded areas where the victims' bodies were later found.
The sources make it very clear that this was not just a high libido. This was an intense pathological compulsion that merged the desire for sex with the necessity for control and ultimately the environment of his crimes.
He even admitted to investigators that he simultaneously used the services of sex workers regularly, while also admitting, in his own words, that he hated most of them.
That internal struggle, the clash between his rigid religious projection and his overwhelming pervasive lusts and aggression, it created this psychological landscape that was just. It was primed for the escalation to murder.
He felt entitled to use this vulnerable population and, in his warped psychological framework, maybe even justified in eliminating them.
And that contradiction, the devoted churchgoer and the prolific predator, that was the key to his ability to just blend into society for so long.
Turning now to the mechanics of the murders, the modus operandi detailed in the sources, it reveals a strategy really focused on minimizing noise, maximizing speed, and maintaining control.
His primary hunting grounds was along Pacific Highway South, targeting women whom he knew would not be missed quickly.
The victim selection process itself was highly methodical, highly predatory. He needed to establish a quick sense of trust.
And the sources reveal a particularly chilling deception tactic he used. He would sometimes show the women a photograph of his young son.
Just to project this image of harmlessness, normalcy, a family man.
Exactly. Lowering their defenses just moments before the attack. That profound breach of emotional trust is just deeply disturbing.
And as for the method of killing, it was alarmingly specific and consistent.
Yes. The sources explained he killed most victims swiftly after picking them up. He'd carry out the act either in his home, inside his truck, or after driving them quickly to a secluded area he had already scouted.
And the technique he used was integrated directly into their interaction. The detail is, it's grim, but it's necessary to understand his mechanics.
It is. After just a few minutes of sexual activity, usually intercourse from behind, he would transition immediately to the murder. He would wrap one forearm around the front of the victim's neck and then use his other arm to pull back tightly, executing the strangulation.
This consistency suggests a pre-planned, practiced routine. It was all aimed at efficiency.
And the pathology takes an even darker and more complex turn when we examine the role of necrophilia in his crimes.
Right. He didn't just dispose of the bodies in wooded areas around the Green River or near the SeaTac airport. The sources confirm he would frequently return to the dump sites.
Over the subsequent days and weeks, to engage in acts of necrophilia.
And here is where the calculating nature of this killer truly emerges. It distinguishes him from other offenders who might act purely out of some impulse or heightened deviance.
His later explanation for this horrific practice, it wasn't centered on achieving greater sexual gratification from the deceased. In fact, he stated he didn't find it more satisfying.
So why do it?
It was a management technique. He claimed that having sex with the deceased reduced his need to find a living victim. It was about limiting his exposure to being caught by reducing the frequency of his predatory hunts.
That is a terrifying level of rationalization. It wasn't just a compulsion. It was a calculated criminal risk management tactic.
He used the desecration of the deceased body as a means of controlling his own compulsions. He was ensuring the longevity of his killing spree, all while maintaining his facade of normalcy. It speaks to this chilling blend of psychopathy and strategic thinking.
And beyond controlling his impulses, he also took these deliberate, methodical steps to confuse and mislead the task force.
The sources describe his body dumping strategy. The bodies were often left in clusters, which suggested a single rapid spree. They were sometimes posed, usually nude.
But he went further than that. He was actively trying to contaminate the crime scenes.
The contamination strategy was all about introducing noise into the investigation. He'd leave items like gum wrappers, cigarette butts, or even written materials that didn't belong to him or the victim.
The goal was just to scatter the forensic evidence, make it harder for investigators to develop a clean, direct profile of him.
But perhaps his most ambitious attempt to evade detection involved, well, it involved interstate transport. The sources provide specific details about the 1984 murders of Denise Bush and Shirley Sherrill. He moved their remains across state lines into Oregon.
And the calculated coldness of this act is it's shocking. He disguised the transport as a mundane camping trip with his own young son.
He placed the remains in the trunk of his car, a Plymouth Satellite, right alongside his son's bike and camping clothes.
Unbelievable.
And the sources detail how he methodically paid for gas and food using cash all throughout Oregon to avoid creating any paper trail or verifiable link connecting him to that state. This showed that even early in his spree, he had this clear forensic awareness and was actively trying to evade the kind of local scrutiny the Green River Task Force was imposing.
Which brings us directly to the decades-long investigation, a process that was just fraught with challenges, missed opportunities, and then eventually the triumph of forensic science.
That methodical nature that we just discussed, combined with the technological limits of the era, it just severely hampered the early task force.
Let's focus on those missed opportunities first. When the body of the first known victim was found in July of 1982, investigators documented a crucial piece of physical evidence.
The spray paint.
The unique spray paint found on clothing wrapped around the victim's neck. But, according to the sources, this paint sample wasn't subjected to detailed chemical analysis for nearly 20 years.
20 years. If that key piece of physical evidence had been processed immediately, it might have provided a much earlier link to Ridgway's workplace.
So the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force right after 4 more bodies were found in quick succession. But despite the rapid mobilization and the sheer magnitude of the resources poured into the case, Ridgway was already operating just under the surface.
He first became a specific suspect in 1983. This was after the disappearance of Marie Malvar. Her pimp and boyfriend identified a specific model of truck parked at Ridgway's house that they believed she had gotten into.
So he was brought in for questioning. The police received multiple tips pointing toward him. And yet, this colossal missed opportunity occurs in 1984 when Ridgway submits to and passes a polygraph test.
The polygraph.
This failure of the technology, or at least the methodology surrounding it, it seemed to clear him in the minds of some investigators.
And while his kill rate did decrease significantly after 1984, the fact that a serial killer of this magnitude was allowed to walk free based on that result, it's one of the most tragic footnotes in this case's history.
And to compound the complexity, in 1984, the task force sought some unconventional outside counsel.
They did. Investigators, notably Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, went and interviewed the incarcerated serial killer Ted Bundy, seeking insights into the mind and methods of the Green River Killer.
That consultation it's truly a remarkable and chilling chapter in investigative history.
It is. And despite his own heinous crimes, Bundy, offering advice on another killer, actually provided highly accurate insight.
What did he say?
He suggested that the Green River Killer was not merely disposing of bodies, but was revisiting the dump sites to engage in necrophilia. He urged police that if they located a fresh grave, they should stake it out and wait for the killer to return.
An observation that we know now was completely accurate. It confirmed the suspicions that FBI profilers like Special Agent Johnny Douglas had already formulated.
Right. But even with Ridgway on the periphery, the case just left on. It stalled. The task force continued to follow thousands of leads, but the evidence gap was just too wide until technology finally provided the bridge.
And that turning point was 1987.
Yes. The police, still suspicious despite that polygraph result, took hair and saliva samples from Ridgway under a warrant related to the ongoing investigation.
Crucially, these samples were meticulously stored and preserved in evidence for years. They were just waiting for a scientific advance that simply did not exist yet.
And that advance arrived 14 years later. By 2001, DNA profiling technology, particularly the methods used to analyze degraded or minute samples of mitochondrial DNA, had evolved dramatically.
So the 1987 samples, sitting in cold storage all that time, were finally reanalyzed, and the results provided a definitive link.
A definitive link. It connected Ridgway's DNA to the biological material found on the bodies of several victims, and that triggered the arrest warrant.
The arrest itself was swift. November 30, 2001, as he was leaving the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, Washington,
where he had worked as a spray painter for decades. And this workplace, this was the key to securing the final, overwhelming forensic corroboration that married the physical evidence with the DNA.
Let's spend a moment on the forensic science here because it speaks directly to the persistence of the investigators.
It's incredible. A forensic scientist identified microscopic spray-paint spheres, these tiny, tiny particles on the clothing and bodies of multiple victims.
We're talking Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, Carol Ann Christensen, Wendy Caulfield, Debra Bonner, and Debra Estes.
Right, and this was a detailed chemical analysis. These microscopic spheres were linked to a specific brand, a specific composition, and a specific hue of paint used only at the Kenworth factory where Ridgway worked.
So this evidence, which had been noted but not fully tested way back in 1982, ultimately helped secure the indictment for multiple victims.
It provided a physical connection. The bodies had traces of his work environment on them, and that just solidified the DNA evidence. This dual confirmation was simply insurmountable.
The overwhelming evidence led to the arrest and indictment, initially on 4 counts, which then rapidly expanded to 7 based on that spray paint evidence. And this set the stage for one of the most ethically and politically contentious legal maneuvers in the history of King County.
The plea bargain.
The plea bargain.
By the summer of 2003, Ridgway's defense lawyers were urgently seeking a plea bargain to remove the threat of execution. And this negotiation, it posed an extraordinary moral and legal dilemma for the prosecutors, especially the King County prosecuting attorney, Norm Malang.
The gravity of giving a prolific killer immunity from the death penalty, it must have been immense.
Absolutely. The resulting deal was harsh, but it was strategically focused. Ridgway would enter a guilty plea to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. In exchange, the state agreed not to seek the death penalty.
But crucially, this deal was entirely contingent upon his absolute and ongoing cooperation.
Yes. In locating the remains of his victims and providing full, truthful details about the circumstances of the murders.
The political difficulty of this decision it can't be overstated. Norm Malang faced intense scrutiny from the public and some victims' families who rightfully demanded execution.
He provided a powerful public justification, though. He explained the decision not as an act of compassion toward the killer, but as a strategic path to justice and closure for the grieving families.
He explicitly stated that the deal was the avenue to the truth, and that the mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway, but toward the families who have suffered so much.
It was an ethical calculus. It prioritized the emotional closure of potentially dozens of families over securing the ultimate penalty for one man.
And here is the core practical detail that really justified that choice. The sources confirm the deal included 41 victims who would not have been the subject of a successful conviction without Ridgway's cooperation and confession.
41 cases.
41. There's just insufficient evidence at the time. Without his help, those cases would likely have remained cold, and those remains might never have been found.
So that strategic trade-off life for closure is just a profound illustration of the limits of forensic science at the time.
The sentencing, which occurred on December 18, 2003, it reflected the magnitude of the crimes even without the death penalty. King County Superior Court Judge Richard A. Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 consecutive life sentences.
Without the possibility of parole.
Without the possibility of parole.
And the penalties were stacked to reflect his methodical impotence of justice. On top of the life sentences, he got an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims. That's an extra 480 years.
So this comprehensive sentencing ensured he would spend the rest of his natural life incarcerated. It recognized both the murders and his deliberate attempts to frustrate the investigation.
And his cooperation was immediate and tangible. In 2003, right after the plea, Ridgway led prosecutors to the burial sites of Pammy and Etta Vent, Marie Malvar, and April Buttram.
Finally bringing closure to those families.
His confession details also provided insight into his motives, which were just as callous as his actions. He initially claimed 65 victims, later updating that number to 71.
And he reiterated his calculated selection process. He acknowledged he targeted sex workers because they were easy to pick up and, as we discussed earlier, confessed that he hated most of them.
He also elaborated on his management of his own compulsions. He stated that he began burying his later victims specifically to resist the urge to commit necrophilia.
Though he did admit to having sex with the bodies of his victims after killing them for a significant part of the spree, this self-management, again, just points back to that calculated drive for longevity and control.
And the sources confirmed that the investigation continued to close cases even after his original sentencing. The 49th conviction came after the discovery of the skull of Tracy Winston in 2005.
Winston had disappeared in 1983. Her skull was found miles away from where the rest of her body had been discovered, which confirmed the interstate transport and the deliberate scattering of remains.
And that finding led to the formal charge and his 49th life sentence in 2011.
A similar timeline unfolded for Rebecca Marrero. Her remains were found in 2010. Ridgway had confessed to her murder in the original plea bargain, but formal charges couldn't be successfully filed until that physical evidence was recovered.
So he was formally charged and received that 49th life sentence for her murder in 2011, providing that long-delayed closure for yet another family.
Even 2 decades after his conviction, this investigation is.
Yeah.
It's far from complete.
Not at all. The fact remains that authorities believe Ridgway murdered at least 71 women. That's based on his own confessions and circumstantial evidence. It suggests that several sets of remains are still undiscovered.
The King County Task Force still maintains an active victims list. It contains names of women who Ridgway confessed to killing, but whose remains have never been found at the specific dump sites he indicated.
Women like Casey Ann Lee and Patricia Osborne. This ongoing lack of physical evidence just drives the continued and often frustrating search efforts.
But that relentless search for closure has been significantly aided in recent years by radical advances in forensic science, specifically genetic genealogy.
This technology has allowed investigators to finally restore the names and identities of victims who were long known only by these descriptive aliases, like Jane Doe or Bones.
The identification of Lorianne Rispotnik in December 2023 is a profound example of this commitment. Her remains, known for decades in the case files simply as Bones 17, were discovered way back in 1985.
And through sophisticated DNA testing and cross-referencing with genetic databases, they were finally able to identify this 15-year-old girl who had run away from home in 1982.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. In 2021, Wendy Marie Stevens, who was tragically just 14 years old, she was identified after being known for years as Jane Doe B10.
And the sources detailing the original forensic analysis are important here. They noted her estimated left-handedness and a healed skull fracture. These were details that were crucial in early identification attempts, but were only fully validated by the final DNA confirmation. These details restore a fragment of her humanity that was lost to the case file.
And the list just keeps growing, even in the last year. Most recently, January 2024, another case reached closure. Tammy Charlene Lyles, known previously as Jane Doe B20, was identified.
Her partial remains were found in 2003, revealing she was an Everett teen who was murdered during that highly active first decade of Ridgway's spree.
These identifications, decades later, they just underline the immense, unwavering effort by forensic teams and law enforcement to provide closure.
They also explain the necessity of maintaining contact with the killer himself, despite the public controversy that often surrounds those actions.
Right. That public controversy relates directly to Ridgway's movements post-conviction. The sources reveal that investigators have repeatedly taken steps to ensure Ridgway remains accessible for these ongoing efforts.
Sometimes sparking public outcry, but always driven by the singular purpose of finding those missing remains.
That's the entire story behind his transfer history. In 2015, Ridgway was briefly moved to a high-security federal prison, USP Florence High in Colorado.
And this move prompted a massive public backlash in Washington state. It was fueled by the concern that he was too far away to assist in locating victims.
Following that significant public outcry, he was returned to the Washington State Penitentiary later that same year. The Corrections Secretary, Bernie Warner, explicitly explained the return was to ensure Ridgway was easily accessible for ongoing open murder investigations and the possibility of future searches.
And that necessity became evident again much more recently. The sources detail a temporary transfer in September 2024 when Ridgway was moved back to the King County Jail.
At the time, authorities refused to give a full explanation, which led to a lot of intense speculation.
But the purpose of that move was confirmed when the transfer order was unsealed in March of 2025. The order explicitly confirmed that the temporary move was necessary for Ridgway to actively help authorities locate more victim remains.
This action, taken over 20 years after his conviction and nearly 40 years after the fight of his crimes, just demonstrates that law enforcement is still working to utilize the killer himself as the final, frustrating resource in the quest for total closure.
When we synthesize the enormous body of information regarding Gary Ridgway, the dual reality of his life is perhaps the most striking and profoundly disturbing element of the entire case.
Indeed, you have the ordinary functioning adult on one hand, a truck painter who worked consistently at Kenworth, a former Navy man, a seemingly devoted religious man who proselytized door to door, a father.
That was the facade he successfully presented for decades.
But beneath it, however, was the reality of a figure capable of extraordinary, prolonged, and calculated violence.
His methodical use of strangulation, his calculated target selection, and his chilling adoption of necrophilia, not for sexual heightening, but as a forensic risk management strategy. It all highlights his terrifying control and self-regulation, all aimed at sustaining his killing spree without detection.
The enduring legacy of the Green River Killer case is therefore not just the sheer tragic volume of his confirmed convictions, which is horrific enough. It's the unwavering, decades-long commitment from the early task force to the modern forensic analysts to identifying and recovering the remains of every single woman he harmed.
This process of searching, of identification, and seeking closure, as demonstrated by the most recent DNA breakthroughs and those recent transfers, is still actively unfolding decades later.
And the pursuit of truth, which was enabled by that very controversial plea agreement, is a profound and ongoing demonstration of the justice owed to the victims.
And we must remember the names of the 49 women and the many more who remain unidentified, whose lives were stolen by his calculated violence. The clarity and detail provided by these sources remind us of the immense and lasting human cost of these crimes.
Thank you for joining us for this analysis of the sources surrounding Gary Ridgway.
Thanks for listening.